Today's devotion is based on the story of Jesus cleansing the temple. I will read the salient passages from the book of John. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." When a story appears in all four Gospels, it's worth paying attention to. The lectionary from March 6th dealt with the story of Jesus and the money changers. It's also called Jesus cleansing the temple, and some wags have even called it Jesus having a temple tantrum. This is one of the stories of Jesus, though, which appears in all four Gospels. That it appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's not particularly surprising, since Bible scholars believe they all derive much of their material from a common source, the Q source. The Q stands for Quelle, which is German for well or source. Biblical scholars believe it's the oldest recorded information based on an oral tradition. Mark's believed to be the oldest written book about Jesus' teaching. Now, the first three Gospels are called the Synoptic Gospels, and synoptic has as its root the word syn, S-Y-N, which means together, like synagogue, like coming together, and optic, which means to see. Synoptic, therefore, is seen all together. That is, three different witnesses viewing the same situation in different ways. And each of the Gospels are going to have their own biases and preferences. And then there's the book of John, which neither sounds like the other Gospels, nor was it written in Aramaic or Hebrew. Since the book of John was written around 770 AD and reached its final form in 120 AD, scholars hypothesize that there may have been a Johannine community of Christians living apart from the Jews, either willingly or having been excommunicated. The three John epistles, 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, and the book of Revelation are all believed to have been influenced by this community, if not written by the same person. By the way, as I said, it was written in Greek, and if you ever have the opportunity to study New Testament Greek, the very first book in the Bible that you will read is 1 John, because it is all subject, verb, predicate noun, or predicate adjective. Really simple and really rewarding. So why is it important, if it's important at all, to have this story of Jesus cleaning the temple? It's in all of the Gospels, but the timing and the emphases are different. In the Synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the story appears during what we call Passion Week, several days before the Passover. If we think that John was written chronologically to reflect Jesus' ministry, it occurs right after Jesus' first miracle in Cana of Galilee, which was the changing of water into wine. Now, a skeptic might say something's the matter. He either did it at the start of his ministry or he did it at the end of the ministry. Of course, he could have done it both times. And that would provide a really nice piece of symmetry to his mission. There's something for it being said that it was not a one-and-done event either. If he did it at the start of his ministry, it would certainly have gotten the officials' attention and set him up for conflict from the start. And there's nothing to suggest that this hypothesis that Jesus routinely turned over tables in the temple is in fact true. However, I'm simply saying he may have done it more than once. So as mentioned earlier, each of the gospel carries a bias and preference. Matthew, for example, was preaching to the Jews. He frequently referenced scriptures to prove Jesus was the Messiah, to foretell what and why Jesus did things, and to try and convince Jewish readers through historical, scriptural, and traditional sources that Jesus was the promised Messiah. Luke was the storyteller. His relaying of the stories of Jesus in comparison to Matthew tended to be geared more towards the Gentiles and the dispossessed. He's sympathetic to the ill, women, and children. He has Jesus use parables to describe what the kingdom of God is like and how we're all called to work for it. Mark was the first source and tends to be short and sweet. There isn't a lot of detail in Mark. It's just the facts, ma'am. No explanation and scanty details, especially in comparison to Luke. And then there's John. It was clearly written for an educated community that skewed Greek. It used a lot of what would be called light imagery, signs and symbols, and the famous I am statements. So we have 4 sets of witness accounts, and the truth is probably greater than any one part. So of all of the stories of Jesus, why does it appear in 4 books? The cleansing of the temple is both a theological and a political act. The Old Testament is quite clear about what our responsibilities as children of God are. The Shema says that we are to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, and mind. And Leviticus, in its chapter on holiness, has dead in the center that we are to love our neighbors as ourselves. Throughout the Old Testament, people are warned not to take advantage of the poor, to take care of widows and orphans, not to set stumbling blocks in the way of the disabled, to treat the stranger and the refugee with respect because they were once strangers in a strange land, and to treat each other justly and equitably. The prophets warned the people when they turned from God and when justice was meted out unfairly between the rich and the poor, God was not amused. There would be hell to pay, whether in exile, being prisoners in their own land, or God's turning away from them. Jesus' message in the gospel and in describing what the kingdom of God is like reminds people he is, in many senses, not preaching anything new. However, he really means it. Inequity, justice skewed to the rich, exploitation of the poor were not and are not God's intentions. You can either change your own way, or God will do something to get your attention. This leads us to Passion Week and the cleansing of the temple. Observant Jews, if they could, would come to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. They needed to pay a temple tax and make sacrifices. Now, if one was traveling a long distance, chances are your animal sacrifice would get damaged along the way. Thus, many sold animals and took the price they'd received to Jerusalem to buy their sacrifices there. Now look, if you've ever lived in a college town and there is or was only one industry, and that industry was the college, you're well aware that prices can get seriously inflated. There were strict rules also as to what kind of money was acceptable to pay the temple tax and to buy your sacrificial animal. It couldn't contain any images because of prohibitions against graven images, particularly in the temple proper. Thus, the foreign currencies were exchanged for acceptable currency for tithes, taxes, and sacrifices. Now, if you've ever traveled overseas and you have US dollars, you have to have them exchanged for a different currency. There's always some money that's taken off the top by the bank or the cambio to account for exchange fluctuations and to pay for their efforts in getting the proper currencies to you. Now, the money changers acted much like the banks when we exchange one kind of currency for a different type. However, the amount they took off the top hit the poor the hardest. If you don't have great financial reserves to begin with, any loss becomes painful. $100 for a poor man is considerably more than $100 for a rich man, although objectively, they're the same amount of money. The poor were being exploited. The money changers had engaged in a wink and a nod with the priests at the temples, who received kickbacks from the money changers. This was a comfortable, I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine relationship between the bankers and the priests, who continued to ask for more and more. If you came from outside the area and thus were a stranger in a strange land, you were again subject to exploitation. The money changing, the animals, and the unholy money took place in the temple courtyard where the Gentiles worshipped. The Gentiles, being unclean, would be there praying, but they wouldn't be allowed within the temple proper lest they defile it. The Gentiles got the animals, the dung, and the money changing. From a theological standpoint, exploitation of the poor, the foreigner, and the not us is constantly decried in the Old Testament. Taking of interest and of buying favor was denounced, both in the buying of influence and in the selling of it. Jesus, according to John, didn't just walk in one day, comment that he was shocked about what was going on, and then turn over the tables. Evidently, he'd been there before because he came with a whip made of braided cords to beat the money changers and drive out the animals. He charged that the bankers and the priests were in collusion and had made the place a den of thieves, in that each provided safety for the others. This was planned. The cleansing of the temple was also a political act. Jesus was proclaiming that God cared about the poor. God cared about the widows. He cared about those who didn't have power and was calling into judgment those who exploited the helpless. He spoke truth to power. Power wasn't having it, and by the end of the week, that bothersome troublemaker would be hanging on a cross. Now, this is a reminder for us to be aware of which side of the money changers' tables we're on. And it's also a reminder of our need to act in ways to prevent exploitation and unfairness. So which side of the table are you on?